Hi there, Michael Volshinovich here, and in this tutorial we are going to be taking this image here and focusing on skin retouching within Capture One Pro and getting it to its finished state, which is this, entirely in Capture One. So we got a lot to do, so let's go ahead and get started. Before we do, make sure you follow me via the social media links below, and also find me on my website at vibrantshot.com. So what we need to do here, first of all, this tutorial is going to be focused on Capture One version 12 or 20, so those are the two latest versions. I would really recommend having one of those because a lot of enhancements have been made within those versions over past versions in terms of how many layers it supports, the performance, and some of the features that it has. So I would say version 12 or 20 are ideal for this, although it can, most of this will translate to version 11 as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So our original version is this. I've cropped this image a little bit and made some minor adjustments to it, like just adding a little bit of contrast. I might back off this highlight a little bit here because it's quite bright and we don't want to make those highlights any brighter than they are. And in fact, we're going to recover a lot of these highlights. As you can see here, we have done that with the finished product. So that's not a problem. We can definitely handle that, especially with version 20, which adds all of the different sliders for whites and blacks, whereas with version 12, we only had highlight and shadow. So that's really nice to have as well. But either way, we're going to be kind of really targeting those highlights in a very specific way. So it will work in 12 as well. So with that baseline established, we're going to go through a typical sort of workflow that we would have within Photoshop. We're going to just kind of translate that to Capture One Pro. And so we're going to need a bunch of layers to handle this. Now, because this is not necessarily a course on color grading, I'm just going to neutralize this color a little bit using one of my actions. So you can see that it's quite green and yellow. So I've got this action here, and I'm going to apply it as a new layer. And then going back here, I'm just going to back off the opacity of that layer to maybe about 50% there, just to kind of get rid of some of that. And you can do that just using some of the color adjustment tools that I've talked about in various videos before this. So we've got at least a decent starting point, I think, that is fairly neutral. And the next thing we're going to do is start looking at something like healing, and then we're going to move on to dodge and burn. Now, unlike in Photoshop, where we should start with healing because healing is a rasterized kind of adjustment, in Capture One, that's not the case. It's not really rasterizing anything, so it doesn't really matter at what stage you do the healing, but I think logically it makes sense to do healing first and then move on to dodging and burning. So what we're going to do is add a heal layer, and you can do that in one of two ways. You can either click here and say new heal layer, or you can add a new empty layer and then convert it to a heal layer using the drop down. So I'm going to call this heal 1. And the reason why we're going to have multiple heal layers will soon become apparent, because healing, unfortunately, it's not quite as developed, obviously, as it is within Photoshop, because again, we're not working on a rasterized image. We're still working on an image that is a raw file, and so it's very flexible in terms of what we can do, but unfortunately that flexibility also has certain limitations in terms of how it does healing. So what I'm going to do is grab a brush, and then we're going to select an area we want to heal. In this case, I want to maybe just remove these subtle lines that we see on the neck here, and that is obviously these are very faint, and I really probably would leave these normally, but I'm just going to use them as an example of how we can use the healing brush. So we're going to just go over them with a brush that is more or less the same size, obviously, as the area we want to heal out. And then as soon as you make a brush stroke, you get this sort of reference point being displayed, so it's telling you where it's sampling from, and you can move that around. And unfortunately, the actual indicator, the preview, is not terribly indicative of what the final result will look like. So if you just kind of let it go, you'll see that it looks fine, even though it looked kind of bad with the preview. So just sort of find something that looks the least bad, and then you'll see that once it sort of figures it out and does all the math, it'll look a lot better in the final product. So you kind of have to just trust that it will work. So again, we can go through, go over that line and just kind of wherever we need to. And if you want to see your mask, you can always hit the M key, and that will show you where you painted over. And as you can see, you can be pretty sloppy about it, and it's fine. It does a really good job of sort of figuring things out and where they should be. Now, if we, for example, try and draw a line here, I don't think this is going to work, because you can see that the reference point was above. And so what it's doing is it's referencing this jawline portion of our subject. And so obviously it doesn't work there. So we would either have to change our reference point to something else, or alternatively, if you want to remove that line, create some sort of additional heal layer for that. So there we go. I don't know why when I removed that it didn't refresh, but just a slight nudge on the reference point made it refresh it. So If you ever run into that, just kind of give that a little nudge. So I'm gonna leave this line for now, but obviously if we wanted to remove it, I would just create another heal layer and just paint over that and create maybe a sample point down below here or something to that effect. Either way, I'm gonna create a new layer. We're gonna call it heal 2, and I'm gonna work on the face because I figure I'm probably gonna have a different reference point than I had on the neck. So let's go ahead and just move up here, and I'm just going to remove some of these little spots, and obviously they're pretty minor, nothing to really get hung up about, but the first thing we need to do is make that a heal layer, so let's go ahead and do that. And then obviously we don't want to sample the eyebrow. That is not going to look great. I don't know why I picked that area, but that's fine. We can just move it to something else, and then we just keep going. And obviously if you find that after you've painted a few of these and the reference point doesn't work, we can try and find a different reference point and see if that works better for us. Let's try something else here. There we go. That one I think looks pretty good for all of the points that we've sampled. And we can also try and remove this and see how that looks. That's pretty good as well. So overall, I mean, not a ton to do skin-wise here, but this is just to kind of give you a demonstration of how healing works in the context of Capture One. So really just that limitation of the single source point. But as you can see, that source point is fairly flexible, and it does a good job of sort of figuring out, the magic behind the scenes of how to translate a certain source texture into something that works within your destination point. Now, obviously, if you use the clone tool, that's going to be a little bit different. That's just going to clone directly from the source point. So it's just a typical sort of clone stamp tool that you would find in Photoshop. It's whereas the healing brush is more analogous to the healing brush within Photoshop, where it does a little bit of math behind the scenes to sort of figure out, texture, color, luminosity, and what it should translate the final result to. So it's quite intelligent in that sense. And so you don't need, 100 of these heal layers. Usually 3 or 4 is pretty good to remove most of the blemishes that you have. So that's it for healing. So the next thing we need to do is move on to dodge and burn. So let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit here, and we're going to start creating our dodge and burn stack. Now, as with dodging and burning within Photoshop, I do recommend that you have some sort of a tablet for this, like a Wacom Intuos or something like that. Works really nicely, and it definitely helps versus using your mouse. So definitely have a tablet for this, because you really do need that precision to be able to kind of draw in the areas that you need specifically. And so to create these stacks, we're just going to create a new layer, and I can call this something like dodge. And then for dodge, we know that with dodging, we are brightening. And I imagine right now you're pretty familiar with the mechanics of dodge and burn, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. I have courses on dodging and burning, videos on dodging and burning, so follow up with those if these details are kind of confusing to you. But generally what we're going to do is we're going to brighten certain areas with dodge, and we're going to darken certain areas with burn. So knowing that, we have to create a brightening curve. So we need to create something that is going to brighten a certain area, and then our burn is going to do the opposite, which is to darken a certain area. Now, in this case, I've got a simple stack of just a dodge and burn layer, but oftentimes I do want to make that a little bit more fine grain and have a dodge and burn layer that is more faint and one that is more aggressive, and then have a separate stack for contouring. So for that, we basically need 6 layers, and we actually need a 7th layer for a helper layer. So what I've done is I've got a script that I use for this, and you can find the details on the script in the description down below. But basically, I just run this, and it asks me what image I want to insert it into. So I want to insert it here, and I want all of my layers, and it's going to create this whole stack for me, which is quite helpful. And so you can see I've got dodge corrective, which is just a light increase in the curve here, versus dodge corrective strong, which is it's less on the RGB but more on the Luma. So you can see I've brightened both RGB and Luma in this case. And the burn corrective is basically the opposite of that. So it darkens, and then burn corrective strong does the same thing as the dodge corrective strong, except obviously it darkens instead of brightening. And then we have the same things for dodge and burn contouring, which are just really simple adjustments to the RGB curve as well. And then finally, we've got the dodge and burn helper. And the dodge and burn helper, really all it does is it helps us to visualize these areas that we need to target a little bit better. So for that, what I've done is I've darkened down the RGB curve. So I've really kind of made the image darker. So again, it brings out some of those, we'll call them imperfections. And so on top of that, I've kind of darkened it slightly by bringing down exposure, and I've desaturated it. So again, desaturating allows me to just focus on luminosities as opposed to being distracted by colors. And then I've opened up the shadows a little bit just to make sure that, everything that was dark didn't go completely black on me as a result of me darkening it down here. And then I've increased clarity again, which helps to pull some of that out. And now the one big difference as well is if we hit the M key, you can see that the helper layer is a filled layer. So you can do that just by going into here and saying fill mask, whereas all of these layers here, the contouring layers and the corrective layers, if I hit the M key, there's nothing. It's not painted in because we're going to be painting it through the dodge and burn process. So that is our stack created. And we can go ahead and actually start targeting certain areas. So I'm going to start with, I'll start with the dodge and burn strong layers, and maybe we'll look at a detail, like for example, the lips. And so this is kind of typically where I use the strong layers, is when I'm working on a detail like, you know, lips, maybe eyes or something along those lines, where I know I need to be more aggressive with the dodge and burn. In this case, we don't have to be super aggressive, but I'm going to use it as an example nonetheless. So the first thing we need to do is grab a brush. And with that brush, we're going to right click and we're going to make the flow rate 5%. And we can obviously type this in as well, which is sometimes easier. Opacity at 100% and then hardness at 0. And I personally am not going to use pen pressure for this. I also don't use pen pressure inside of Photoshop because, again, it just sort of adds an extra variable that you have to control, you know, how hard you're pushing your pen down. And I don't find that that's terribly helpful. So right now, actually, we're going to select the burn layer first, I think. And what I tend to do is just sort of make a stroke and then hit the M key just to make sure that I'm sort of painting in the right area. This is the only downside I find within Capture One, is that the cursor is not sort of as indicative of the area that you're painting on as it is inside of Photoshop. I find the cursor just does a better job of sort of highlighting the area we're going to be painting. So you have to be a little bit careful with that and sort of a matter of getting used to it. So let's go ahead and keep painting here. I don't know what happened to my cursor. So again, let's just do a little zoom in here just to refresh it, and then we can back out. And you can see here that if if your cursor becomes too small, you just get this plus point as opposed to the circle, which is really kind of easier to see. So depending on how fine of an area you're working on, you may have to zoom in and out a little bit. So that's kind of the only thing that I'm hoping that one day maybe the people at Capture One will change, is to just make this cursor a little bit more user-friendly for dodging and burning. Maybe just kind of creating a customizable cursor that you can select, what do you want, the legacy cursor or this newer style. So let's go ahead and go into the dodge corrective strong. And we're just going to dodge out a few areas here. And again, we can just hit the M key to make sure that our mask is sort of targeting the areas that we want to target. And we'll zoom out a bit so that we get a better idea of how things are looking. All right, so that's that. And let's just kind of toggle on and off the burn layers. So you can see we've sort of just made them a little bit more uniform. And that really is just, a couple of strokes and you get there. So fairly straightforward there. And then we're just going to jump over to our dodge corrective, and I'm going to look at some of the other areas that we want to target here. So maybe under the eyes, we're going to do a little bit. And then again, let's just hit the M key to see what our mask is doing. And then just sort of adjust your brush size as needed for that particular area. And this really is one of those things that you just, get better and better at. Even when you don't see the cursor, you kind of have a pretty good idea if you're painting the right size or not. And you may be thinking through all of this, well, why not just do this inside of Photoshop? And certainly if you have a ton of dodging and burning to do, and you're working on something like, a beauty editorial or a commercial beauty shot where you're going to be doing tons of skin retouching, then absolutely it still makes more sense to do it inside of Photoshop. But if it's, for example, a model test shoot and, you just want something that is natural and fairly raw looking, then there's really no point in jumping all the way into Photoshop, creating a rasterized file that is much larger. At the end of this, once we're finished this image, we're just left with a metadata file that is a couple of megabytes as opposed to something that is, potentially a gigabyte. And then we're left with the flexibility of being able to change this down the road if we want, because we haven't really, rasterized anything. All of this is still really flexible, and we're working at the raw level, so we're getting the best quality possible, which is also really nice. So it has its advantages, and it certainly has its disadvantages, because obviously it's not quite as simple as working in Photoshop. So it's just a trade-off, and ultimately it kind of just depends on the specific image that you have, the use for that image, and so on. So let's zoom out a little bit. I'm just going to grab a larger brush here, and I'm just using the square brackets up. It's same shortcut as it is in Photoshop for increasing and decreasing the size of the brush. And you can of course do it just by right-clicking and adjusting the size there to whatever you need. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this dodge and burn because I think you get the idea. I'm really just sort of painting over the areas that I think are too dark, and then I'm burning over the areas that are too light, just to kind of make everything nice and uniform. And there's a couple little spots here that we could zoom in a little bit and fix. So let me just do that as well. So this little guy over here, once again, just hitting the M key to make sure that I'm not painting too large. And a lot of these spots are just obviously freckles, which I don't want to remove. I want to keep those. And it really does pay to zoom in and out quite often just to kind of get an idea whether or not, you're targeting the right thing. And if you have to zoom in a lot, like obviously I had to zoom in to target, for example, the lips, but when it comes to the overall face, you shouldn't have to zoom in a whole bunch. I mean, you have to zoom in really close if you're working on, micro dodging and burning for a beauty shot, which you shouldn't be doing in here anyways. So for the most part, your dodging and burning really will be focused on, being able to see the entire face. You don't really want to be dodging and burning at this level if you're just working on skin in general. So obviously there's a couple of little areas still that I could burn in over here, but I think we're close enough that we're getting to a point of diminishing returns. So that is fine by me. Let's go ahead and just kind of toggle and see what we've done here. So we've just sort of filled in some of those patches with the burn tool and kind of evened out some of those with the dodge tool. So as far as dodging and burning goes, I'm pretty happy in terms of the corrective stuff. So the next thing we're going to look at is the actual contouring layers. And the contouring layers are really just designed to bring out a little bit more depth and dimension in your subject. And you can see that by default, the script that I have has set those to 50% opacity. And the reason for that is it just gives me a little bit of latitude to go either up or down from my starting point. And I find these are one of those things where quite often when you're done, you find that you've either gone overboard or you'd like a little bit more. So if you start at 100% and you want a little bit more, your only option really is to add more by further dodging and burning it on those layers. Now, obviously in Photoshop, you had other options. You could actually create a levels adjustment on the mask itself, which you can't do here. So I really wanted to have a little bit more latitude, and that's why I'm starting these at 50%, and you can certainly do that in your particular image as well. Now, one thing I do want to show you is if you're kind of wondering, well, what do I do if I don't have this script? Do I have to create these manually every time? Well, the answer is yes and no. So what you can do is, let's say that we go into this image here. This was sort of the original, and we insert this stack one more time. So I'm just going to insert these. No, I just want the selected image and all. So let's say I've done this once. You've gone through and manually created this stack. What you can do is kind of use this and treat this image as a donor image. So basically it's going to be an image that you have in your catalog, or you just open up another session or something like that, or you do it once a session. So maybe for every shoot you have one donor image that you manually go through and create all of these stacks, and then make sure you don't have any other adjustments on that image because they're going to be copied over as well. So what we're going to do is, once we have this donor image ready and we want to get it into another one, we can click on the copy here and then go to the image that we want to work on now and click apply, and you'll see that it'll copy all of that stack over for you. So you can't create a style that has all of these preset, because styles don't work that way, but you can create a donor image once within your session or within your catalog and just always copy out of that. So that's kind of a hack that you can use for it if you need to. Okay, so with that digression, I just wanted to mention that in case you were looking for a shortcut for creating these layers. So let's go ahead and actually start the contouring. So with the contouring, what we want to do is just kind of focus on, I usually start with the highlights, but it doesn't really matter where you start. So we're going to do dodge contouring. And let's just pick an appropriate brush size here. So once again, I'm going to make a stroke here and just kind of see that that looks pretty good in terms of size. And we're just going to work on any areas that have highlights already. We're just going to kind of boost them up. And, typical areas for contouring are kind of right in here. And then maybe a little bit on the forehead. And then oftentimes the lips are a good candidate. So let's go ahead and just brush over those. Once again, just hit the M key. I think our brush is maybe a tiny bit too large, so let's make that a bit smaller. And then in here, I would like to kind of go around the Cupid's bow, so let's just make a stroke there, and just hitting the M key just to make sure my brush size is good. And then again, zooming out, maybe a little stroke there. And we can also work on the neck. Now, obviously in the neck here, there was areas that we could have dodged as well. You can see that some of these lines we didn't remove. You can certainly remove them using the corrective stack. I'm not going to do it on the contouring stack, but that's certainly an option for you. Now, keep in mind too that any sort of, we'll call them quote unquote imperfections that you're seeing are multiplied by the fact that we have this helper layer. The helper layer there is to kind of bring that out. So once you get rid of that, unless you are converting to this contrasty sort of black and white look, you're not going to notice a lot of these things anyways. And then another area where we oftentimes would dodge is sort of in the clavicle here. So that's kind of it for the dodging, I think. Let's maybe add a little bit more here. And one thing I also tend to do in this kind of scenario, obviously, you know, if we're doing a beauty shot, I would do it separately. But I oftentimes will just brighten the eyes within the actual contouring layer as well. It kind of just depends. If you want a separate layer, that's certainly fine. If you want to kind of have more fine-grained control over how much you adjust them, but I just do a little bit of brightening within the eyes there, so we can see that effect. In fact, I would encourage you to create a separate layer, but for the interests of creating a shortcut here, I'm going to do it inside of the contouring layer. So jumping back into the burn contouring layer, now we're going to burn the shadows in. So we're going to look at a larger brush size here, and wherever you have a shadow area, we're going to sort of darken it a little bit more to create that extra depth. So down below the lips now, on the inside of the lips, maybe right here, and again, just hit the M key to make sure we are doing what we want to be doing. Right here, we definitely want to add a little bit of depth, maybe in this shadow area, oftentimes here within the eyes. And you can, for example, darken down the brows as well if you'd like. You can also target the eyelashes, make them a little bit darker. I'm going to make one quick stroke on this side, but generally you want to focus. We can see that the light is definitely, you know, creating more shadow over here on this side of the nose. So I'm going to just emphasize that as opposed to trying to play it up on both sides. Maybe a little bit there, and let's just see what we're doing with our burn contouring. Okay, and then let's go ahead and zoom out entirely. So there is our burning, there is our dodging, and you can decide if you want more or less now. So if we want to increase that, for example, if we go into our dodge contouring and we increase it, you can kind of see as we go up what happens with that. And I think, you know, this is too much. So I think we had it right at about 50%, but certainly we can scale back down or up as we need to. So annoyingly enough, unfortunately, there's no good way to visualize all of these changes before and after without actually toggling off this dodge and burn helper layer. What we can do is, obviously, if we hold down Option key and we hit reset, it will get rid of everything, but we kind of don't want that. Ideally, I would like to be able to sort of toggle you know, just the dodge and burn layer separately. And for that, we'd need something like a group, which maybe will come at some point in the future. What we can do to sort of simulate this is just go to the background layer and just take out all of our saturation for now and maybe darken it. And then what we can do is we can hold down the Option or Alt key and click here, and we can see kind of the fruits of our labor for everything that is the dodging and burning. And as I look at it, I think I probably dodged this spot on the lips a little too much. I should have just left a little bit of that highlights. We can certainly go back and fix that now. So we have our dodge corrective strong. We can go back into here, and if you ever need to recover something, you can hit the mask key. And actually, actually no, we want the burn layer. That's what we want. So again, good to confirm by clicking the M key that you're on the right layer. So we can see that we definitely did quite a bit there. So if we want to remove that, we can just hit the E key, and that's going to bring up our eraser. And if we right click, just make sure that your flow rate and opacity are up there. So that's actually going to remove it pretty quickly. Or you can, for example, remove it a little bit more slowly. Actually, I'm going to do about 35%. And I'm just going to gradually remove that with one stroke there. And that I think is good. And actually, yeah, that did it. I think that's better. Okay, so that's all you need to do if you need to recover anything there. And again, Option or Alt. Once again, we'll just kind of preview, make sure everything is looking to our liking. And overall, I'm pretty happy with our skin work there. So now that we've dealt with the textural and luminosity issues within the skin, now we just need to finalize the image by looking at color. So oftentimes when we dodge and burn, those areas that we've painted on can experience a little bit of a color shift. So we're going to deal with that just through one single layer in Capture One and using the uniformity tool. So the first thing we need to do is get rid of this background adjustment that we made, which was to desaturate it. Just by double clicking that, we can get rid of that, and then we're going to reset our curve. So we've made that just so that we can preview our changes there, but we want to get rid of that. Obviously, we want to go back to having a color image. So let's go ahead and go to the top here. I'm going to create a new layer. We're going to call it skin tone, and it's up to you if you want to keep the helper layer. You can remove it if you'd like, but I oftentimes just keep it so that I can use it if I need to refine the dodge and burn a little bit later down the road. So we've got our skin tone layer, and the next thing we need to do is actually make a mask. So what we really want to do is just mask in all of the skin and keep everything else out. Just because if you don't really do a mask, you just fill the entire layer, then I find sometimes it'll shift the background, it'll shift certain areas that we don't want. So it's best to just create a quick selection. I'll show you it's very easy to do. So the first thing we want to do is hit the M key to reveal the mask and hit the B key to bring up our brush. And for size, something like this is going to be fine, I think. And we just want to make sure that our flow rate is 100%. So we're just going to paint in the areas where the skin is. So something like this. And don't worry about being super precise. Just get, more or less close enough to the edges. And I'll show you the refine tools do a pretty good job of everything else. So we just want to kind of enclose it so that we've got it all as a sort of circular bounding box around the areas that we want to fill. And then technically I could have, I'm actually going to undo that. I'm going to exclude this white area where the highlight is just because I don't think it's really going to match up in the adjustment. It's so bright anyways. We're just going to exclude that portion. So let's go ahead and just select that. And we're going to go into here and select Fill Mask. And that is going to fill in our mask for us. Now, the last thing we want to do is just select out the lips, because the lips are obviously, a certain reddish tone, and we don't want it to get blended in with the rest of the skin because it's different. It's a different color, and we don't really need these uniformity tools on there. So hit the E key for your eraser and just make sure that your eraser's flow rate is up there as well. And unfortunately, there's no way to kind of make a selection of the bounding area and then have it fill erase. So we just have to kind of erase it ourselves just by brushing out the whole area. So once we get the outline, then we can brush it out and we can grab a larger eraser. Don't have to be as careful as we did around the edge. And you can do this before or after the refine step, although I do recommend doing it before, just because I find that the refine step does a nice job of kind of tightening out the lines around the lips. So better to just get it done. Oh, what happened here? Looks like I erased a spot there. There we go. Okay. So now that we have the area more or less selected, we can go into here and say refine mask. And I tend to use a fairly large radius to start. And if it doesn't look good, we can bring it down. But I find, large is good. It'll kind of make a nice selection. And this selection doesn't have to be 100% perfect. It just has to be, good enough. So we can bring it down if we want and see what happens. I think, somewhere around 110 looks pretty good. All of the lines around the clothing and around the periphery of the face look good. The lips look good, so I'm pretty happy with that. We're just going to apply it. So we've got our selection of the skin. Just wait for that mask to complete. And now we're going to go into our color tab. And if you scroll down, you're going to see this color editor section and a skin tone section. Now hit the M key to hide the mask because we don't really need it anymore. And what you really want to do is just click this eyedropper and find an area of skin tone that you like. So generally I recommend picking something that is a mid-tone, usually somewhere on the forehead. That is a good spot. You don't want to pick a deep highlight here or a really bright, a deep shadow here, or a really bright highlight, somewhere in this area. So focus on something that is a mid-tone, that is a pleasing skin tone. And I think something like this is pretty good. And then what it'll kind of do is try and make the rest of the skin uniform to that particular tone. And you can do that using this hue slider. And you can see as you kind of go about this, it does even it out quite a bit. And you don't want to go crazy with it because then things just start to look a little unnatural and almost too uniform. One other thing that you can do, and we should probably do this, I think, on this image, or I can, just tend to tell you about it, which is to remove the eyes. We see that if we go way up here, and way down, you can see that there is a fair bit of yellow within her eyes. Now, obviously, if you've got brown eyes or really blue eyes, it probably won't make a difference. But because we have some yellowing within her eyes, it's going to affect her eye color. So we can easily remove that just by going into the mask again, hitting the eraser, and just removing it out. For the time being, I'm just going to leave it so that this video doesn't drag on for any longer. But something to be aware of as well. Lips and eyes are two areas that you may want to remove. So I think for me, I'm going to push it somewhere to around 50, I think, is looking pretty good here. And one thing you'll notice is as we kind of go through this, it has also pushed the tone a little bit. So you may or may not like the actual hue that's happening. So the uniformity is going to make it uniform into some certain target hue. And if you don't like that hue, you can, rather than kind of trying to pick a different spot on the face, you can just adjust the overall hue here. So if you want it more green or more magenta, we can make an adjustment for that. So maybe something like that. And what I'm also going to do is maybe bring down saturation a little bit more over here. And then with saturation uniformity, this is one that I use sparingly because what happens is if you crank it way up, you can see it just starts to look unnatural because generally speaking, the saturation will vary depending on if it's an area of highlight, midtone, or shadow. So you don't want those to all blend together. You want to keep those saturation variances. So what you may want to do is just kind of, set it to something like 6 to 10. Don't go crazy on it. And then it will just sort of, make it a little bit more uniform, but at the same time not encroach on being unnatural. And then the lightness uniformity, again, it's not something I use because, as you can see, if you crank this up, it just starts to look bad. And generally speaking, we've handled lightness variances by targeting them specifically using dodge and burn. So because we've dealt with the problems that we had in terms of luminosity, we don't have to deal with them using this uniformity slider. And we certainly don't want to affect areas that we actually want to be shadow areas and areas that we want to be highlight areas. So I tend to leave that alone. So overall, that is sort of the general retouch. Now, the last thing we have to deal with is the highlights, which are, I think, a little bit distracting. You can see in this sort of image that we had, we've tamed those highlights, and we can certainly do that here. And for that, we're going to create just one more adjustment layer, and we're going to call this one highlights, or HL, to make it short. And what we need to do is target the highlight areas. Now, one thing we can try and do is we can try and fill this mask. And if we move into our exposure tab, we can try to just recover it using the white slider. So if we crank this down, you can see it's doing a pretty good job of recovering that detail within the hair and the background. But we can certainly be a little bit more targeted with this. And if you are using Capture One version 12, this will be the approach that you'll want to take anyways because you don't have this white slider. So what I would recommend is just leaving this alone. And what we're going to do is we're going to use Luma Range. So we're going to select the Luma Range that we want. And for that, we obviously want to target highlights. So we're going to just pull this all the way to the edge. And we're going to pull this one here. And we're going to say Display Mask. So now it's giving us the area that we want. And for this, we can just kind of bring up the radius a little bit. And just kind of make this so that it transitions a little bit more smoothly. And as we bring up the sensitivity, you can see that it's just kind of making this mask a little bit smoother. And again, radius will also do that. It will just kind of soften it out. So something like that, I think, looks pretty good. And if we apply that, what we can also do, if we hit the M key, we can grab our eraser and grab a nice big eraser, and we can just remove it from certain areas that we don't want to target. So for me, I don't really want to affect the shirt. And I don't think the face is selected anywhere, but just in case, we can kind of remove those areas. We can see there was a little bit on the cheek there. And that's fine. I think that's all we really want to target. And now we can use either the highlight recovery to bring that down, or you can use the white slider or a combination of the two. So something like that, I think, is going to be pretty good. There we go. And the reason I like that is because if you apply it to everything using the white slider, sometimes you can flatten out some of the highlights on the face. So by doing that, we targeted that specific luminosity range, and then we brushed out certain areas that we don't want. So even if you find that that luminosity range falls on the face, we can, as you see, hit the M key and just remove it from the areas we don't want affected. So that Luma Range tool is really nice for doing this kind of adjustment. So overall, I think we've come quite far in this particular image here. So if we hold down Option and we reset, this is where we started, and this is where we have ended up. So now to finish this off, I can just grab one of my style presets, maybe this one here, and apply it as a new layer. And then we will just back off the opacity a little bit. So there we go. There is our finished image. And if we, once again, hold down Option or Alt and hit reset, it's our starting point. That's our finished point. And as you can see, we've come quite a long way using just Capture One. And the end result of this is just a metadata file that is a couple megabytes, and it really just gives us a lot of flexibility as to what we can do with this file. Later, we can change a lot of stuff around. We can, further manipulate the raw file itself if we need to down the road. There's really just a lot that we can do that we couldn't do if we did all of our retouching within Photoshop and then came back and we're working on a rasterized file. So certainly, there's certain disadvantages, there's certain advantages, and it really just kind of depends on the circumstances that you're working within, what the image will be used for, what the target is, and then obviously the type of image that you're using. So it's certainly just another tool within your arsenal, and you can choose to use it whenever you need to. So hopefully you found that helpful. Again, all of the links to the action and my style packs are down in the description below, and we will see you in the next tutorial. Bye for now.